Thank you, Simon. It's been really a great pleasure to have this amount of attention lavished on the book that my colleague and I are writing. You rarely in the academic world get a group of very smart people coming hour after hour to ask you the same question. So it's much appreciated, and hope we lived up to the expectations. So for those of you who did come to the seminars, what you'll get here is a little bit of an overview of the argument of the book as a whole, but it won't simply repeat what you've already heard. For those of you who didn't come to the seminars, you will find out why I'm doing this and what I'm doing. The slide you see in front of you is intentionally skewed off screen. It's a Venn diagram showing the amount of overlap between literary criticism and financial modeling. And not only is the amount of overlap tiny, but so is there's almost no overlap between the screen and the image itself, and that's pretty much what this is all up to. Okay, I gotta get the right lighting situation here. After teaching and writing about Victorian literature and culture for almost 35 years, I've recently embarked on an enterprise that most people consider completely different from my previous work. In collaboration with Kevin Brine, who worked on Wall Street for almost as long as I worked in a university, I'm writing a history of financial modeling, mostly in the United States and mostly during the 20th century. In the main part of this lecture, I want to describe the argument of this book and give you a couple of examples to show you what kind of history we're writing. As a conclusion, I'll say a few words about our collaboration, which to some people is as interesting as the subject of the book itself. Now, screen left intentionally blank. There's an enormous risk in doing what I'm doing, even as late in my career as I'm doing it, which is turning to a completely different discipline. Obviously, you risk looking like an idiot. You also risk losing the audience that you have painstakingly spent all of these decades developing. And so I'm fully aware that the blankness on the screen in front of you could represent the reception of this book, but kind of hoping it doesn't. I wanted to say a few things about how I came to write this book. Kevin Brine, who had a very successful career on Wall Street, was a trustee at New York University where I teach, and he had audited some classes with me, and one day he came to my apartment and he took out of this massive briefcase a bunch of books. For example, A History of the Modern Fact, Making a Social Body, Genres of the Credit Economy, The Modern Way, and then he had his hand on the table next to it where there was a blank place, and he said, now I'm going to tell you what your next book is going to be. And I said, oh, really? And he said, yes, it's going to be about the way of making truth claims that came after facts. Long silence. And I said, well, what is that? And he said, well, it's modeling, of course. I said, I don't know what modeling is. And he said, it's what runs Wall Street. It's all those financial models that run Wall Street. I said, well, I don't know anything about Wall Street. And he said, well, you know, it's what's making 20th century America what it is. And I said, I don't know anything about America or the 20th century. So I said, okay, Kevin, I'll write this book if you'll write it with me. And so at that point, this collaboration began. And about a year after that, he had given me an assignment of certain books to read, and I drove out to his house in Southampton, and I said, Kevin, I don't understand a word of these books. And for the next 3 days, he drew diagrams, he showed me how the math worked and all this kind of stuff, and I very morosely drove back to New York and started writing. And within a month, we'd written the first chapter. So that's how it's going. Lots of fits and starts, but it is a very interesting project. Okay, like the models, did I get this thing coordinated? Like the models used in other areas, climate change models or the models that cost out expenses for future health care, modern financial models are predictive tools that help people make decisions in conditions that are inherently uncertain. Financial models are driven by, I'm sorry, I'm getting the timing of this mixed up here. Okay, are driven by expectations denominated in financial terms and based on both causal and correlative relationships, which in turn rely on statistical inference. So they are instruments of epistemology. They extend the epistemological work done by statistics. Within the financial industry, the use of these models is ubiquitous. Every risk metric that prices financial assets according to future cash flows, like the value at risk model, and every algorithm that assumes that investors rationally balance risk against reward, like the capital assets pricing model, uses the kind of financial models devised and refined during the last half-century. The financial model is central to our inquiry, however, not simply because it is used so extensively by professional investors. Beyond Wall Street, financial models are now used to manage risk in nearly every facet of our lives. Whenever the Federal Reserve intervenes in the economy by changing lending rates, and whenever investors use the Fed's actions to predict future swings in the economy, they are using assumptions implicit in financial models. Forward-looking statements, economic forecasting, your financial advisor's predictions of future returns, and portfolio diversification theory all are driven by expectations written into financial models. Now, I know that in the UK, because you still have, generally speaking, a pension system, you're not quite as enmeshed in the stock market as Americans are, but I suspect you'll get there. We call our book The Modern Way of Knowing: Studies in the History of Financial Modeling because we see this book as a continuation of the inquiry I began in A History of the Modern Fact. The argument of that book was that the basic epistemological unit in the 18th and 19th centuries was the fact, whose ultimate form was statistical. Facts occupied the border between an observed particular and a theoretical paradigm. This border and the facts that composed it defined what could be known, what could be true. In the modern way of knowing, we argue that models have taken over the role once played by facts in all kinds of knowledge claims. Instead of saying it is a fact that, modern scientists and creators of knowledge are likely to say, my model shows that so-and-so. The central argument of the book, and this will help explain why we focus on finance, is that the way we live now is shaped by properties that are unique to finance. Since the late 19th century, in a process called financialization, finance has progressively penetrated nearly every aspect of modern societies. And as a consequence, we now face kinds of uncertainty that are in some ways quite different from the uncertainties that confronted people in the past. So financialization, here's a little thing about the rise of financialization, just in numerical form, went from 1.5% of the GDP in 1947, 2.5% of the GDP. In the late 70s, 4% of the GDP, and in 2006, 8.3% of the GDP. And GDP, by the way, which is gross domestic product, is itself a construct that was created in the decades that we are writing about here. You couldn't have known what percentage financialization played in the economy until that metric was created. We argue that financial models were developed as responses to this uncertainty. These models substitute simulation and rule-governed automatic choice mechanisms for the highly subjective judgments that individuals would otherwise make. Paradoxically, of course, as we saw in 1987 and again in 2008, the models developed to manage risk and uncertainty can also destabilize the system that they are intended to govern. The capacity of financial models both to augment and manage uncertainty stems from the properties unique to finance. Unlike economic transactions in which real products change hands, finance involves intangibles. For this reason, financial transactions are only as reliable as the contracts and laws upon which they rest. And because they involve deferral, financial assets keep the exchange window open for longer periods of time, during which anything can happen, including things that are unpredictable. Every model is a composite of many tools, concepts, and methods. And as a particular model is refined and adopted, its constructed nature tends to disappear. The more a model is used, the more impenetrable the black box that encloses it becomes. Most analysts who use financial models would be hard-pressed to explain how they work, what algorithms the models operationalize, and what theoretical and methodological elements they contain. What we try to do in the modern way of knowing is explain how this came about, how 21st century citizens became so used to models that we now take for granted that these mediating tools will reflexively transform, channel, and transmit virtually all of our personal and collective policies, attitudes, preferences, and opinions. And so the questions we're asking in the book are, first of all, how did the role of models come to be taken for granted? And secondly, how did finance as a component of the economy become visible so that a management tool like the model came to seem certain? So what you have here is a dialectic of visibility and invisibility that plays itself out across the instrument of the model. We begin the historical narrative of the modern way of knowing in late 19th century mathematical economics and the versions of applied finance that flourished in post-Civil War America: commodities, future, bond trading, insurance. So that's chapter 1, which we call methods. We then explore the rise of American corporations at the turn of the 20th century and the corporate adaptation of an accounting system developed in the Renaissance. This is double-entry bookkeeping. From corporations, we turn to the first government-sponsored efforts to collect large-scale data sets on the eve of World War I, then to the legal and administrative revolutions of the New Deal. So this is chapter 4, which is called Financial Innovation and Regulation, when FDR tried to use financial reform to jumpstart an economy stalled by the Great Depression. Finally, in chapter 5, we discuss the creation of national accounting systems in the 1930s and 1940s, which made a statistical picture of the nation's economy visible for the first time, and which prompted economists to create the first macroeconomic models. We also examined the theoretical and technological innovations that revolutionized applied mathematics during World War II, including the invention of computers, the military planning known as operations research, and the development of game theory as a means of mathematicizing choice. Finally, we arrive at the emergence of modern finance, which was introduced into economics departments and business schools in the 1960s, and the invention of financial models, which began to be used on Wall Street in the 1970s. So the analytic object that is the subject of our book only appears at the very end of the book, because the argument that we're making is that you have to know how these pieces came into being and got put together. To give you a sense of how the book proceeds, I'll briefly describe 3 of the episodes we narrate. Let me first tell you a little bit about what's distinctive about this book. Since you probably aren't in the field of economic history, I'll just really quickly go through this. Most economic histories focus on ideas had by great men in response to each other. We focus instead on analytic tools, not primarily ideas or individuals. We emphasize that these tools were embedded in history and institutions, that they did not belong to the natural evolution of economics toward greater and greater scientific status. We emphasize finance rather than primarily economics. We emphasize primarily the American context, even when some of the economists we talk about were not Americans by birth. And we emphasize the components from which financial models were composed rather than the modern models like the Black-Scholes model and so on. And I just want to acknowledge that there are bodies of scholarship on this subject. One group of people are economic historians like Phil Morawski, Perry Merling, Ann Mayhew, Mark Rubenstein. These are all people who in the American context would be called heterodox economists. If you're not an economist, you don't have to worry about this. And then there's also a group of people who work in social studies of science, Donald McKenzie, Alex Prada, and then there's a group of people who work in the history of modeling, like Mary Morgan and Ted Porter and Rainey Daston, who also works on the history of epistemology. So we see our books in our book, In the Happiest of All Worlds, as affiliated with these nice people and not affiliated with other people who are not so nice. To give you a sense of how the book proceeds, I'll briefly describe 3 of the episodes we narrate. The first involves the creation of modern indexes in the 1920s. Indexes are important to models because they put aggregate prices and quantities into time series, which allow the analyst to see change over time, or trends. Indexes are also important because they bring data into economic analysis, and data has always been central to finance. The second episode focuses on John Maynard Keynes' theoretical assertion that finance, in the forms of the money supply and interest rates, is the linchpin of a nation's economy. This macroeconomic argument was critical in the history of financial models, both because it convinced people that governments should manage economies by adjusting interest rate, and because the translation of Keynes's theory into a formal representation or a mathematical representation was one of the first examples of mathematical modeling. Macroeconomic models are important to finance, which is a microeconomic activity, because every financial decision is made in the context of assumptions about macroeconomic factors like interest rates. So if you're going to make a decision about whether to put your money in an IBM stock or whether to put your money in a utility stock, you would make that assumption in the context of your assumptions about how the interest rate is going to be changed by the Federal Reserve in the long run. Or somebody else would make that decision for you. The final episode I'll describe involves the work of the Kohls Commission, a nonprofit organization founded in the 1930s to conduct economic research. This uniquely American institution pursued 3 projects, all of which were important to modern financial models: the foundation of stock indexes, the introduction of formal techniques to account for probability, and the transformation of economics associated with game theory. More specifically, the founder of the Kohls Commission, Alfred Kohls III, created a stock market index in the 1930s. In the 1940s, another member of the commission used a technique called the simultaneous equation method to factor probability into models. This allowed them to factor in uncertainty. And after World War II, members of the commission began to use game theories to lay the groundwork for what's known as the efficient market hypothesis. The 3 episodes I describe will thus allow you to see the invention of a statistical tool, a mathematical model, and an econometric method, all of which are now used in financial models. What you won't see in this lecture is a financial model, per se, because we haven't written that chapter yet. So let's begin with index numbers. You're all familiar with indexes because every day you hear about the Dow Jones Industrial or the FTSE or the Hang Seng or any other stock index. When you hear about changes in the Dow or see a stock market graph, what you are seeing is the moving average of the aggregated share prices of 30 companies that the Securities and Exchange Commission has chosen to represent U.S. industrials. Tech stocks are represented in the United States on another index called the NASDAQ. The average represented by each point on the graph is actually not a simple average of the 30 companies' aggregated prices, but a price-weighted composite number produced by adding the data supplied by the 30 companies and then dividing the total by a number that takes account of the company's stock splits and dividend payments. You'll be tested on this at the end of the hour. There is an algorithm for creating the numbers denominated by the Dow average, in other words, just as company analysts use algorithms to create the numbers that represent the individual companies. So if I had a laser pointer and I pointed to each one of those little spots on that moving graph, that would represent the kind of amalgamated construction that I'm talking about here. But what you really mostly see when you look at that graph is a trend. Like you see that the trend is kind of going along flat until about 1988. Then it starts going up, and then it's way up in 1903, and then it's way, way up in 1907, and hello, 2008, not 1907, 2007. 2008, it goes plunging down again. That's the recent Great Recession, and then it goes back up again. So when you see that graph, all of the work that's implicit in making that graph is the use of these algorithms to make up these composites that can get drawn onto that graph. Now, here's the trick about indexes like the Dow. Like the price of an individual commodity, the numbers in the Dow bring together a financial measure, which is designated in currency terms like pounds or pence or dollars and cents, and a quantity measure, which designates the commodity in measurement terms like bushels or ounces. Okay, now you can't put together currency units and measurement units without doing something to one or the other. Just as money allows you to value incommensurate commodities or services in prices, which are expressed in a single set of units, dollars or pounds, so the index allows you to represent aggregate prices and aggregate quantities in a series of numbers that show their changes over time. These numbers are actually the ratios of two statistical aggregates, one showing prices and the other showing quantities. You are at this moment wondering why in the world I gave up Jane Austen for this kind of thing. But believe me, it is quite interesting to get your head around this. You may not believe it, but it is. The index itself can only show, let's see, I lost my place here. The index itself can only show the financial or the quantity side of the composite. You can have a financial index or a quantity index, but not both together. As a financial index, the Dow, that little graph that you saw a minute ago, has nothing to say about the quantities of goods produced by the 30 companies, although that information has been used to create the numbers for each company. And even though the Dow is taken as a leading indicator of the well-being of the economy as a whole, that means that what's represented on the Dow occurs before what happens in the real world, okay? So the real is always lagging behind its representation in the index. Mary, you're looking so confused, but it's true, believe me. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was first created in 1896 by Charles Dow, who also founded the Wall Street Journal. And here you can see that what Kevin and I are doing, even though I got that slide out of order, is putting in the context of the historical specifics of when these things were created, the creations themselves. Okay, so the very first index numbers were created in the early 18th century by an Anglican bishop, you'll be glad to know, who wanted to trace the decreased purchasing power of money in relationship to a basket of consumer goods. So in other words, he wanted to be able to show inflation at work, although that was not the term he used. This kind of construction was first called an index in 1837. And by 1900, economists generally agreed on the functions and basic components of these numbers, although not significantly about how to construct them. In the 1920s, after the US government began to require companies to collect and submit data in the lead up to World War I, a debate about how best to construct index numbers erupted among American economists. The debate that divided economists in the 1920s turned on the issue of whether it was possible or desirable to develop a single formula for constructing index numbers, or whether every data set required a formula that was fitted exactly to its particular properties. The first position, the positions that said there should be one ideal index number for everybody, was taken up by Irving Fisher, who is generally considered the first American mathematical economist. And the second position was taken by a guy named Wesley Clair Mitchell, who was an expert on currency, who helped create the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER. Fisher had been trained in mathematics, and his dissertation applied mathematical techniques to the equilibrium model formulated by 19th century European economists like Jevons. As a historian of currency, Mitchell was passionately committed to the extensive data sets the nonprofit NBER had been created to generate. Both were respected professors of economics, Fisher at Yale and Mitchell at Columbia, and each man articulated a position held by many in the discipline. To summarize the debate in which these two economists engaged, it's sufficient to say that Fisher thought the best way to create a formula for creating index numbers was to use mathematical principles, while Mitchell insisted that the statistician should not lose track of the ultimate facts that lay behind the index numbers, which the index numbers tended to obscure. Because index numbers could be evaluated or tested by both the deductive method Fisher preferred, that's the mathematical method, and the inductive checks that Mitchell emphasized, that is, going up from data, they constituted a flashpoint in what was beginning to seem like an unresolvable tension between using inductive and using deductive methods to make economic arguments. You know, the problem for economists is you can't see the economy. The second problem for economists is that you can't do experiments on the economy. God save us if you could. And so what they have always had to do is come up with alternative ways to relate their theoretical claims to the data collected from the world. All economists acknowledge that constructing index numbers involved interpretation. The statistician had to decide how many data points constituted an adequate sample, whether and how particular components should be weighted, how to correct for errors that inevitably appeared, and what outliers to discard. Where economists did not agree was whether index numbers should be valued for their fit to the data, that's the inductive method, or for their mathematical rigor, that's the deductive method. To Fisher, it was exhilarating to think that economic formulations could be liberated from empirical data and from history, because this would allow the rigor associated with mathematics to insert logic into economic research, where experimentation is impossible and the available data is inevitably flawed. To Mitchell, by contrast, the possibility that economic theories could be detached from the historical and institutional conditions that gave rise to data was deeply disturbing, and he repeatedly urged economists to look beyond the index numbers back to the original data from which they had been constructed. Now, Mitchell was a little theoretically naive in the sense that he did not tend to acknowledge repeatedly that data itself is always constructed out of theoretical assumptions. In the domain of finance, the debate about how best to construct index numbers to represent returns on investments was decided in the 1930s, when a financier named Alfred Kohls III and a statistician named Frederick Macaulay agreed on a formula for constructing indexes for equity and bond prices over a long period of time. These indexes, which became the Standard & Poor's 500 and Macaulay's Bond Duration Index, are now routinely used by financial analysts, most of whom, I'd wager, never gave a thought to the debates that culminated in their construction. The fierce debate between Mitchell and Fisher has simply disappeared, in other words, not because one position was deemed theoretically superior to the other, but because financial practitioners found a formula that could be applied without a burdensome number of calculations. This formula was good enough for government work, as Kevin likes to say, because it enabled analysts to construct indexes that were useful to other practitioners who used them as if they were accurate, or as if whatever inaccuracies they contained did not matter. Indeed, in a very real sense, these inaccuracies were incidental then and do not matter now, for the repeated use of the same index number formula by countless financial practitioners has given the indexes both social authority and a degree of professional efficacy that render irrelevant whatever limitations might characterize the number. This process, by which repeated and widespread use confers credibility upon theoretical tools like index numbers, is what Kevin and I call naturalization. Through the social process of naturalization, the constructed nature of these tools has disappeared, and the information the tool seems simply to uncover, not generate or create, is simply taken as given, as the disputes that once swirled around it disappear. This is what we mean when we say that the components of models disappear into a black box that makes their histories disappear. And one thing that was very helpful in the seminars this week is a formulation Pete DeBola came up with, in which he talked about the fact that the modern way of knowing, paradoxically, is also a way of forgetting. And he very helpfully suggested that we are writing the first history of cultural amnesia. But it is very much the case that the claim to know through models is also a claim that certain kinds of items that one can know about the real world are important and others are not. So it's a double process of amnesia. Once economists and statisticians, sorry, we got that word up there. Once economists and statisticians more or less agreed about how index numbers should be constructed, they turned to other issues. In the 1930s, the issue that confronted economists the world over was the Great Depression, which was exacerbated by the collapse of the US stock market in 1929 and continued to paralyze national economies. For according to the prevailing economic theory, worldwide prolonged depressions should have been impossible because markets were supposed to naturally tend toward an equilibrium state in which lowered prices led to greater consumption and eventually to increased employment. This is a principle economists had embraced since the 19th century called Say's law. When this equilibrium did not appear, the US government stepped in with a series of extraordinary measures intended to remake the country's financial system, and economists struggled to understand what had gone wrong. So this is a classic example in which action precedes theory. And here, government action precedes economic theories that attempt to account for it. Once more, the kind of methodological disagreement that had set Irving Fisher and Wesley Mitchell at odds resurfaced, this time in relation to efforts to create a macroeconomic representation of the nation's entire economy. Essentially, economists were divided into three groups. Theoretical economists like Fisher, who embraced mathematical deduction, believed that theory was the primary engine of analysis and thought that general economic laws operate independently of social institutions. Empirical economists like Mitchell, who endorsed inductive methods like statistical measurement and estimation, believed that data was the primary engine of analysis and insisted that social institutions could affect the operation, possibly even the nature of economic laws. And a third group, whose members did not use mathematical language or statistical data, but who insisted that economists should use logic to construct theories that could capture the essence of economic laws. It will amuse you to learn that members of this third group, which included John Maynard Keynes, were known in the period as literary theorists. Let's stick with Keynes for a moment, because the publication of the general theory of employment, interest, and money led to the creation of an early mathematical model. Keynes's important work, which appeared in the winter of 1936, proposed two theories about modern economies. The first was that all markets are interrelated. This means that economists who isolated, say, the commodities market and declared everything else to be stable for the moment — this is a technique called the ceteris paribus method. You say, everything else being equal, I can change this factor and these things will follow. People who use that method, according to Keynes, inevitably overlook the impact that other markets, like the financial market, have on the overall economy. So this is a challenge to the ceteris paribus method, which was the method of most economists at the time. Keynes's second argument was that if people could be persuaded to spend more and invest more, the overall health of the economy would improve. More specifically, he argued, governments can encourage both consumption and investment by adjusting financial factors like the money supply and the interest rate. This means that a government agency like the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England can theoretically increase employment through its monetary policies. And this was a challenge to the laissez-faire assumption. So these days, most people take it for granted that if things get bad in the economy, the government should step in and do something. That assumption follows from Keynes's revolution, Keynes's intervention and the theoretical revolution that followed. Keynes did not present his theories in mathematical terms, nor did he simplify them into a model. Immediately after the general theory appeared, other British economies did translate Keynes's literary proposals into a mathematical form. The most influential of these models was introduced by John R. Hicks at a conference held in Oxford in September 1936. This graphical representation, now known as the ISLM model, shows the relationship between two markets, each of which is represented by a curve, and economists call straight lines curves. The downward sloping curve, the IS curve, the one that's in red on this diagram, shows the investment and saving market. The independent variable in the equations behind this curve is the interest rate, and the dependent variable is the level of national income. As interest rates fall, planned fixed investment, and thus the national income, goes up, because planned investment is sensitive to interest rates, and investment increases national income. The upward sloping curve, which is the blue line, the LM curve, shows the relationship between the liquidity preference, which means your desire to hold cash instead of putting your money someplace where it will get interest, and the money supply. The independent variable here is national income, and the dependent variable is the interest rate. This curve shows the role of finance and money in the economy. There are endless numbers of videos on the internet which will explain to you the mathematics behind the ISLM curve. And they're used in economics classes all over the world. I will tell you that everyone I consult looks to me like a cartoon, and so I'm not sure that I highly recommend you're going to look at them, but this is what the ISLM curve in its very schematic form looks like. Keynes published the general theory at a time when aggregate data about national economies was just beginning to become available, but neither Keynes nor Hicks tried to link Keynes's theories to statistical data. 1930s was the first time that nations began to collect aggregate data, but Keynes didn't really, in this work, take much advantage of it. Instead, both Keynes and Hicks used deduction to reason out the relationships among all of these factors. Keynes used logic to formulate his theories, which he expressed in literary language, and Hicks formulated his model in mathematical language, both a graph, like the one you see here, and a series of algebraic equations. But neither of these economists used the national income data that Keynes was later to promote so vigorously in works like How to Pay for the War. Both Keynes's theory and Hicks's model were extremely influential. The former were used to justify the increased government spending that FDR's New Deal had already begun, and the latter was immediately embraced by economists eager to render the complexities of the national economy comprehensible. Hick's model is now routinely taught in college courses on macroeconomics, even though everybody agrees that the model omits important parts of Keynes's theory, and even though Hicks himself later dismissed the model as merely a classroom gadget. The kind of mathematical model exemplified by Hicks's ISLM graph represents only one of the two routes economic work took in the 1930s. The other was pursued by the Kohls Commission, which sought to heal the methodological rift dividing the economics profession by bringing together mathematics, economic theory, and statistical data in a practice called econometrics. We've already seen that the first important Kohls project was the creation of a stock index that used statistical data to show the tendency of securities prices. To understand the Commission's next two projects, we need briefly to mention a revolution that had transformed the image of mathematics in the 19th century. And here I just want to note that if you're going to write about the history of economics, you have to write about the history of the other disciplines from which economics took their principles and models, most importantly mathematics and physics. That's one of the reasons it's so difficult to do a history like this, because almost no principles developed within economics itself. They were most all borrowed from other disciplines. Okay, this revolution placed mathematics on a new foundation, one composed of a combination of set theory, typology, and axiomization. The methods used in this practice that resulted, which is sometimes called modern mathematics, transformed traditional algebra and calculus, for in dealing with sets, these methods, matrix algebra, matrix calculus, and vector analysis, dealt with variables in numbers greater than the 3 that the Cartesian geometry accommodates, and in a space that is multidimensional. So if you just think about it for a minute, if you're going to try to talk about all of the variables in an economy, there are more than 3 of them, and you cannot draw more than 3 vectors in relationship to each other. So set theory provided economists with a representational system by which they could describe more than 3 factors. Set theory, typology, and axioms allowed mathematicians to work at a greater level of generalization and complexity, and borrowing this mathematical foundation also promised economists a means of modeling the innumerable variables that compose economic relationships. These mathematical tools, by the way, were developed in the 19th century. Economists were quite late in adopting them. To model the complex interactions that compose economic activities, econometricians at Kohls developed a method called the Simultaneous equation method, or the SEM. This method uses linear mixed difference and differential equations to model simultaneous and interrelated changes in a number of economic variables. This part will not be on the test. These equations can also relate different time periods to each other in the same equation, thus depicting the dynamic property of economic activities. And they can take mathematical account of factors that are exogenous to or outside of the economy, like wars or other unpredictable shocks. Random events like these had to be included if the econometricians were to model economic cycles like the one whose nadir was the Great Depression. Matrix algebra is very complicated. This is what it looks like if one is doing it. I'm not going to explain how this works, but just some of you will probably know this, others won't. You will notice that I have begun to use the term model, both as a noun and a verb. With the benefit of hindsight, we can say that the first mathematical and economic models were produced in 1936 and 1937. But most economists did not begin to use the words models and modeling until the 1940s. By 1945, we can find many examples of the term, although economists who were critical of the Kohls Commission approach tended to talk of model systems and analytical machines instead of simply models and modeling. Skeptical economists raised two kinds of questions about these models. First, how did depicting the structural relationship among economic activities in a static set of equations capture the dynamic systems of relationships among the variables? And second, how could the theories implicit in the equations be tested? We need to add a third question that members of the Kohls Commission also raised. Given that models inevitably simplify actual economic activities so that the equations can be solved, and that the available data is inevitably incomplete, how can the modeler be sure that the model is applicable to the real world? To this last question, one of the Kohls researchers, a Norwegian economist named Trygve Havelmo, answered that if the analyst added probability terms to his equation, he can use statistical inference to generate a meaningful relation to facts. So here's a quotation from Havelmo. One can never make exact inferences as to the nature of the nature of the underlying universe. But, he went on, adopting certain rules makes the economist's model useful. To grasp what Havelmo's claim means, we have to take another short detour, this time through the reworking of probability and ideas about statistical inference, which occurred in the first two decades of the 20th century in genetics and agricultural economics. The old way of understanding probability drew an analogy to games of chance. If the sample was large enough for any given try, the probability of choosing, for example, a black ball out of an urn containing equal numbers of black and white balls is 1 out of 2. In most situations, however, one does not know the initial distribution of black and white balls. You don't know whether there's 50% black and 50% white. So uncertainty and contingency must be factored into the probability equation. In this classical understanding of probability, probability is an epistemic matter. It is a function of not having enough information. This old model of probability also assumed that large samples, which is what you need to get an ordinary distribution, were available and could be used. But in some fields, like agricultural crop testing, large samples were not available. If you have a plot of ground, you can only divide it into 6 little subsets and put your seeds in there. So you don't have a sample of 400,000. To address this problem, a group of biologists, geneticists, and agronomists, mostly in the UK, developed techniques for extrapolating from the available data to the statistical aggregates. So the problem here is that you want to make a big claim, but the sample you're working with is small in number. So how can you make the claim that what you see in your little bitty sample holds for the general population? That's the question they were trying to answer. By the 1930s, the dominant understanding of probability had also begun to change. as part of the reworking of physicists' understanding of nature. And so here's the other discipline you have to worry about. This change within physics was linked to the uncertainty principle, made famous by Werner Heisenberg in 1925. Instead of being viewed as an epistemological issue, a function of the observer's ignorance, the stochastic or random properties that made probability estimates necessary came to be viewed as inherent in nature itself. While scientists might still say that natural laws exist, they were increasingly likely to say that these laws are statistical, not causal. And they were increasingly apt to say that degrees of probability, not certainty, constitute the limits of human knowledge. If laws are statistical, then correlations and inference constitute the only methods by which these laws can be inferred. Statistical inference is based on a mathematical frequentist theory of probability, rather than the old analogy to games. In this new paradigm, statistical hypotheses are understood to be statements about a probability distribution. The models based on such hypotheses are in some sense always wrong in relation to particular facts, for every fact also constitutes simply a point within a distribution, and the only way to approach the fact is by representing the distribution as a range. Thus, statisticians had to build in error terms into the models themselves to give them, in Havelmo's words, a certain chance of being true, or of being true within a range. You just got to get your mind around this, you know. And economists had to present their theories as probabilistic statements because the only kind of available facts were rough classifications and approximate measures, to quote Havelmo once more. If economists' theories were probabilistic statements, and if statistical inference was an essential component of knowledge claims, then how could the economist move from abstract probability statements formulated in mathematical equations to statements about economic activities and events, not to mention representations of an entire economy? This was what the simultaneous equation method, which formally introduced probability, was designed to do. Essentially, each of the equations describes a variable which is, in theory, observable and measurable. And the equations contain stochastic or random variables which disturb the system of equations the way an exogenous shock does. In an article published in 1944, Havelmo explained how to use a three-equation model to estimate statistically the determination of national income as an interrelated system of demand functions, production functions, and multipliers. This is taken from Keynes. The article also shows how to calculate the maximum likelihood that the outcome of each equation will be correct within a statistical range. So any kind of statement that one might have made about this is true, this is false, this is a fact, this is not a fact, has to get recast in the terms of this is within a range of such and such of being likely. This has such and such a percentage of likelihood of being holding in the long run. Even though statistical inference remained a subject of concern after Havelmo's groundbreaking work, the simultaneous equation method became the characteristic method of econometricians for the next decade. Some scholars have argued that Havelmo's ideas about probability were insufficiently integrated into this method, but the method undeniably flourished within the Kohls Commission. Just as the debates about index number construction died down as workable techniques began to be used by statisticians in the 1930s, so the debates about statistical inference and estimation gradually quieted, and the simultaneous equation method is now generally accepted as one of the methods essential to econometric modeling. The consensus economists eventually reached about what method is best suited to their discipline did not coalesce around the econometricians' efforts, however. Or, more accurately, the econometricians affiliated with the Kohls Commission reoriented their work after 1948, when the source of the Commission's funding shifted from the Kohls family to another not-for-profit institution which had gained resources and power during World War II. This not-for-profit was the Rand Corporation, which began as a branch of McDonnell Douglas Aircraft, but became an incubator for work on the computer, military planning, and mathematical game theory. When Rand began to fund the Kohls Commission at the end of the war, the commission shifted its attention away from econometric methods and towards the kind of modeling used in game theory. Game theory, as set out by John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern, formally used some of the new mathematical models I named a moment ago to model economic decision-making, based on the kind of probabilistic expectations found in games of chance. Ironically, then, the Kohls Commission failed to unify the discipline of economics around the econometrician's tripartite methodology of mathematics, statistics, and theory, but the turn that Kohls took after 1948 from trying to fit econometric models to data to abstract mathematical accounts of human choice did represent the approach that eventually shifted, that eventually unified the discipline. We can see the result of this turn to mathematics in the scholarly journals in which professional economists, including financial economists, did and still do publish, whereas these journals published almost no articles containing mathematical symbols before the 1930s. Within 40 years, almost every article in every economics journal consists in large part of mathematical proofs. As one historian of the discipline has observed, quote, by the late 1970s, almost all leading journals were devoting most of their space to articles that were either completely concerned with the mathematical analysis of invented mathematical models or with methods of presenting economic ideas using mathematical formalism, end quote. Now, this is one reason that it is so difficult for those of us who are trained in the humanities to read with a to read an economics paper or to talk with economists, because their language is now the language of mathematics. And for those of us who don't have training in mathematics, it is really literally a foreign language. And this is also part of the reason why it's so difficult for lay people, people who aren't trained with higher degrees in economics, to understand the claims that are made on the nightly news about what should be done with the economists. Because the economists, with the economy, what should be done with the economists? I haven't heard that one lately. If economists are speaking in a language that the rest of us don't have the basic vocabulary for, we can't make judgments about the positions that they say the prime minister or the president should take. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, I can't quite get to financial models today, but I can capture some of the points we'll make about them by offering 3 observations about models in general and about how our reliance on them constitute what counts as knowledge now. First, as all of my examples make clear, models abstract from immediate experience and observed particulars in order to generate simplified, manipulable simulations of actual conditions. In doing so, they alter not only one's relation to the real, but also what could count as knowledge about the real. Because models are both performative and recursive, moreover, extensive reliance on them increases the likelihood that models will beget a reality that takes its form from the models, or even that models will beget more models. Second, as models incorporate and are organized by mathematical principles, the mathematical form, which they call the syntax, increasingly dictates the way that the economic or financial content, which they call the semantics, can be understood. This increases the potential for simplification and clarity in the model, but it also means that the rules of mathematics dominate one's experience of messy economic and financial transactions. It also means that formulations that are particularly convenient for mathematical procedures sometimes take precedence over other formulations that might be less mathematically useful, but that are more responsive to human concerns. This is the case, for example, with the GDP, the gross domestic product, which is the headline aggregate featured in the macroeconomic estimates called national income accounts. The prominence of the GDP makes it easy to see whether the overall income of a nation is increasing, but difficult to see how wealth is being distributed among parts of the population, the GDP also makes it very hard to see how efforts to increase the gross domestic product might adversely affect the environment, which is not represented at all in the national aggregates. So every time an aggregate is made, those features of the economy that it does not include become literally invisible. So this is the case, for example, of the contributions that domestic labor, often performed by women in the household, make to the economy, not visible in most national accounting systems. And third, because all of the components from which models are composed have now been commodified, even the data we might naively think of as raw, like our Facebook selfie pictures, can now be marketed. And only people with the wherewithal or expertise to purchase or create models can have a say in how and what these models will be used to do. On this sober note, it's time for me to turn very briefly to a happier subject, my collaboration with Kevin. Neither of us could have written this book on our own, for the different interests and spheres of expertise we bring to the project have both proved essential. What I bring should be pretty obvious. My training in literary history and theory has given me interpretive skills that can be applied to all kinds of text, even mathematical models like the ones you've just seen. This training has also given me a strong commitment to historical narrative, and my previous work in the general area of historical epistemology has given me a vocabulary for discussing the kinds of abstractions modern disciplines now prefer. In one sense, what Kevin brings is also clear. Almost 30 years on Wall Street have given him a perspective on modern finance that you rarely find in a historical study. He knows how the story we're telling turns out, and knowing the outcome of tools that once seemed experimental helps us see how and why they were naturalized. Kevin also has the ability, which I don't have, to see the big picture, and I can't tell you how many times I have picked up the telephone and asked him, why are we writing this? Just remind me one more time why we're telling this particular part of the story. It seems to me quite possible that the kind of collaboration that he and I are engaged in which a person from the humanities goes to a person who's not even really in the academic world at all and tries to create a common vocabulary that we can both use, that might be a paradigm for the way that the humanities disciplines can extend our influence into other parts of the world. I have to admit, and this is my conclusion, that for me, the work has been challenging as well as rewarding. I have no training in mathematics, and I've been learning the history of 20th century America as I go. I initially got engaged in this project because I wanted to tackle something I would find challenging. I wanted to learn something new and to identify the questions that animate another discipline. I wanted to see if the work I'd already done on historical epistemology would pay off when I ventured beyond the literary realm. With a lot of help from Kevin, I think the challenge is proving to be worth the risk it entails. As we work on the last and most challenging chapter of The Modern Way of Knowing, Kevin and I continue to be guided by the two simple principles with which we set out. We don't have to know any more mathematics than what is covered by a university textbook on mathematical economics, and Mary will not write anything she does not understand. Thank you.